Welcome back, everyone, to the 5th video in the Genesis series on spring of 2020. Hope that the last lessons have been very informative to you and helpful. Again, remember, any questions, please direct them to me by text, email, phone call, what have you. I'd be glad to try to answer them for you. Last time in Genesis, we left off with the story between Jacob and how that he had returned from Padan Aram, how that he now is getting close to confronting Esau one more time, and his attitude that he has in his relationship with Esau, how that it's still not everything that it ought to be. He's still, Jacob is still not the man that God intends for him to be. It's kind of sad. We look through the stories of the Bible, look at characters in the Bible, and time after time we see many failures. And this is not, an excuse for us to think that we can fail and God's still going to use us. However, God will use us in spite of our failures. Romans chapter 3, Paul talked about that. God's grace is so great that it forgives sin. And when it says, what shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Then it says, God forbid. Every time we do sin and God forgives, God's grace is shown and God's grace should be magnified. But that's not saying it's okay to continue in sin, because God will forgive, then God's grace is glorified, then back and forth. Remember, a presumptuous sin, a willful sin, the chastening can be extremely harsh, even to the point of death, according to the scriptures. So we must be very careful about that. But Jacob here, he comes back and after confronting with God here at the brook Jabbok. Later, the name of this brook Jabbok here is a place called Peniel. This is where Jacob wrestles with God. This shows his humbleness here. God actually touches Jacob's hip, and from this time on, Jacob limps when he walks. I think it's a constant reminder to Jacob as to his position before God, that you can't fight with God and win. There are going to be consequences to that. But we get here now to Jacob's reunion with Esau. And of course, Jacob felt that this was going to be a very bad situation all around, that Esau was going to destroy him. Remember, he divided up his family into two different troops so that if one was wiped out, the other could get away or such. But the meeting actually turns out to be very friendly. Esau doesn't harbor the bitterness that Jacob assumes that he does. And I think that should be a lesson there for us as well. Sometimes we think situations are far worse than what they are. Maybe a situation where you have somebody else and you've been dealing with someone and it hasn't gone very well. You're imagining that they're mad or what have you, and in reality they're not. Sometimes we imagine, we build up these scenarios in our minds sometimes with people. And we have to make sure that we deal with people in truth and not just in our imagination. But in chapter 33, we do see that Esau wanted Jacob to accompany him back to his land, the land of Seir. And so upon this meeting, he said, come home with me. And Jacob, he agrees with him to go back. However, he says, but first I need to take care of my animals. He said, my Lord knoweth that the children are tender. So I have young kids, and then the flocks of and herds with young are with me, and if men should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die. So Jacob promised, however, he would come back and meet him at Seir. So he said, I'd come home with you, but I got my kids with me. I got the animals here. He said, best I can take care of them first, get them situated. As soon as I do, then I'll join back up with you. However, we never see that joining back up. Jacob, in fact, goes a different direction. Jacob was headed for Sukkoth, which was northwest, while Seir was southeast. So, we're talking completely different areas here, far away. So Jacob again deceives Esau once again. It seems as though Jacob hasn't truly learned his lessons. And, God, for whatever reason, constantly is pointing out the beginning of Israel here the different sins that these people commit. With Jacob, in a little while here, we'll look at his children, the sins that they commit and the consequences of that. But Jacob has an opportunity here to reconcile with Esau, and he doesn't take that opportunity. It's just really a sad situation. Then we go to chapter 35, and now Jacob here is, in fact, some will even call this a revival in the Bible. One of the first revivals in the Bible is when Jacob realizes the importance now of getting things right with God. And if you remember, Rachel had took the household gods, the teraphim of her father with her when they left Padan Aram, had hid them. I don't know if it was, remember, the teraphim, the household gods, were not just for idol worship, like was a big part of it, but those were the ones given, remember, to a son-in-law or to a son or anyone as a promise of them being the chief heir of the family. And I don't know if Rachel was trying to make sure that Jacob became the heir, therefore she would benefit as well. But nevertheless, she did take them. And it was wrong for her to do that for not just the heir reason, but also they were idols. They were pagan. And so what Jacob here does, he gets his and his household to get rid of all the forms of idolatries they have. He said unto his household, and to all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean and change your garments. Now this passage here reminded me of the book of Zechariah. If you remember in the book of Zechariah, Haggai and Zechariah are two prophets that were sent back to Israel during the time of the building of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple in 536 BC. And the work on the temple had stopped, so God sent two prophets there to rebuke Joshua, the high priest at the time, and Zerubbabel, the governor at the time. But very importantly, in chapter 3 of Zechariah, we see that God rebuked Joshua, the high priest, and God called for Zechariah to come before him, as well as calling for Satan as well. And in the passage here we see, in Zechariah 3, it says, and he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. And the Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee, O Satan, even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and stood before the angel. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with the change of raiment. And I said, let them set a fair mitre upon his head. So they set a fair mitre upon his head, and clothed him with garments, and the angel of the Lord stood by. Now, remember, for a practical definition of the word righteousness, not a technical definition by any means, but a practical, illustrative definition of the word righteousness is right clothing. When Adam and Eve clothed themselves with fig leaves in the garden because they realized that they were naked, that wasn't sufficient. So God had to slay an animal and put the animal skins upon him. His right clothing was put upon Adam and Eve, not their clothing, what they tried to cover up their sin with here. Joshua here, the high priest, this is, remember, not that Joshua is in the book of Joshua. He was an Ephraimite in the book of Joshua. This is a Levite because he's a priest, so we know definitely he's not just a Levite, he's Kohathite, a descendant of Aaron. And so he here's pictured with filthy garments. The reason why is because he did not lead the people like he was supposed to lead them, as well as Zerubbabel did not either. But Joshua being the high priest, the spiritual leader of the people, it was necessary for God to confront him with his sin, tell him to take off the filthy garment, take off your own garments, and put on clean garments. Take off your righteousness and put on, God says, put on my righteousness, put on his righteousness. And so what a great illustration this is here. And we see the same, of course, illustration back here with Jacob when he tells them to take clean garments upon them so that they can come before God. So before going back to Bethel, Jacob instructed everyone to destroy their idols, wash themselves, so that the spiritual symbol here of washing yourself physically was a spiritual attitude, making sure that your heart was clean, that your life was clean. And it goes on to say, then take the idols and the earrings, they buried them under a tree near Shechem. There, the Valley of Shechem, very important place historically for Israel. A lot of great major events took place there. Jacob then arrived at Bethel. Remember what Bethel was? Bethel was the place where Jacob went before going to Padanaram, a city that actually was called Luz, L-U-Z, and how that he, there the word Luz means separated.
Sorry, I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
Sorry, my phone just went off. But Luz, which means separated, and he changed the name of Luz
I'm not
from...
sure I'm hearing you correctly. My apologies.
Sorry about that. Siri wants to answer the questions here, I guess. But going back here, Jacob there at Luz changed the name of the city from Luz separated to Bethel, meaning the house of God. Now he's called back to Bethel. And he built an altar there, and he named the altar El Bethel. Remember, Bethel means Beth, B-E-T-H. Beit means house. E-L means God. And so Jacob no longer refers to Bethel really as the house of God, but much more importantly as El Bethel, the God of the house of God. And it's a difference between knowing the Word of God, or difference between knowing the Word of God and knowing the God of the Word. It's not enough just for us to go to the house of God, but make sure that we go to the God of the house of God, and how extremely important that is for us spiritually to make sure that we're where God wants us to be. And so we do see the elements here of revival. To get sin out of your life, whatever sin it is, to make sure that it's gone, it's taken out care of, whether you bury it in the backyard or whatever you do with it. You cleanse yourself. You spiritually put on the clean garments here. You could even in your own mind go through this even physically. As far as the baptism in the Old Testament was that picture of spiritual cleansing. Remember, John the Baptist was not a New Testament character. He didn't baptize in the church. He baptized according to the Old Testament practice of baptism, which showed the spiritual cleansing. Baptism didn't save people in the Old Testament just like it doesn't save them in the New Testament. But it was a symbol of the spiritual purity. When Aaron or any of the high priests on the day of Yom Kippur, before they'd go into the Holy of Holies, they would bathe themselves physically to show that spiritual indication here that they had cleansed themselves before God. So, then we have the sins of Jacob's children. In spite of everything, things still not going the way they ought to be. Jacob's really not where he should be. It's sad because we have this story here of Bethel, of El Bethel, and what a great story and proper story it is. And yet we see Jacob still is not where he needs to be spiritually. That's why we have to be very careful of people. You think about this time that Jacob would be what he ought to be, but he's not. And so that's what I always say. You take people where they're at, not where they're supposed to be. My job as a teacher and as a Christian is to encourage people, no matter where they are at spiritually. If they ought to be serving God successfully, they ought to be. But if they're not, then you deal with them on that basis here. But Jacob here had a problem with his children. The Bible records one daughter of his right now. We don't know if he really had any more daughters or not. The Bible doesn't tell us how many children were born, but definitely one child was born, named Dinah. Dinah was about 14 years old at this time. And she goes off and says, ends up being defiled herself by having a sexual relationship with a Hivite or a Canaanite named of Shechem here. This is a kind of a strange story here, and I don't want to assume and to pass blame on her completely. It could have been all of her fault at this point. It could have been this is what she was seeking after, that she went off in order to do this relationship with Shechem here. it could be part of the culture, as we'll see here later on. In the story of Tamar in Genesis chapter 38, and we'll get to there a little bit later on, but Tamar, of course, remember, is the daughter-in-law of Judah, who is given to one of Judah's sons, and then God actually ends up killing She's given to Onan, and God ends up killing Onan because of sin. And then he's promised to Judah's next son, but he doesn't follow through on that. So she actually goes down by the road, kind of a roadside harlot is where the story is. And we'll look at that here just very shortly on another screen here. But basically she seduces Judah, doesn't want payment for the sexual relationship, but takes his staff, other things, and then goes back home. The point right now of that story, I just want you to see, this is where the harlots would go. And we also see that in the Old Testament times, it's believed among many of the Canaanites and Egyptians that unmarried, unattended women became legitimate prey. This goes here with Abraham. Remember, Abraham lied concerning Sarah. He's afraid what was going to happen to her. With Tamar, the story there. If you remember, the Benjamites in the book of Judges were nearly wiped out because of their protecting the sons of Belial, the men who abused the concubine and then protected by the Benjamites. Later on, because they did not have any men left in the tribe of Benjamin, there at Shiloh, if you remember, they sent their daughters down to dance there at the tabernacle at Shiloh and allowed the Benjamites to hide out in the woods, and when they saw the daughters, they ran out there and grabbed them and took them back, and they became their wives. It's a really deceitful story. It's a very interesting story there if you want to go read that in the book of Judges, the last 3 chapters of the book of Judges, I think it is. Tells the story there of what happened there with the Benjamites and the daughters there at Shiloh, how it was just deceitful on all of Israel's part. It was a mess, because remember in the book of Judges, the key verse was that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And so just a sad thing. This, going back with that story there of the daughters there at Shiloh, with Tamar, with Abraham and Sarah, it may be that they were afraid something would happen, because if they weren't claimed, then anybody could claim them. That doesn't make it okay. All right? But what I'm just simply saying here is that the culture of the people at this time allowed this thing. Again, doesn't make it right. If Dinah was completely innocent in this, that's a horrible situation. However, I tend to think that she wasn't. I think God may protect her differently in this story here. But nevertheless, all we can do is kind of assume certain things about the story here. And we see the consequences, of course, of sin in the story here. Simeon and Levi, upon hearing of what happened to their sister, Dinah, decided they were going to exact revenge upon Shechem and the Hivites at this point. And so they end up deceiving and murdering the Hivites. It says they tricked the Hivites into circumcising themselves. They told them that the only way that we can be allowed to join up with you if you agreed to the physical act of circumcision. And for whatever reason, Shechem and the others agreed to do that. And while they were sore because of the circumcision on the third day, Simeon and Levi actually ends up sneaking in on them and killing out all the people, all the men here. Wasn't right. And first of all, it wasn't allowed by God for them to marry the Canaanites anyway. So God would have taken care of that situation. Again, this is where the human reaction is that we're going to take care of the situation. No need to ask God for help on this one, because we know what to do. And they thought they did. And of course, obviously, they didn't do the right thing. They messed up big time. Ended up murdering these men over this. And the same thing, the sad part about this is Jacob's failure in this as well. See, when all this happened, we don't see anything about Jacob. We don't see, him trying to get revenge or him going to God to take care of the matter or anything. What we do see is that he didn't express any sorrow. There's no sorrow mentioned in the scriptures about his sorrow over the defilement of Dinah. Voiced no regrets for the men of Shechem Shechem and his men to be wiped out. Doesn't say anything about that. The only thing that he is worried about is what's going to happen to him. He's afraid that once these other people found out what happened, that first of all, it's going to look bad on him, and then they're going to try to get revenge because of what Jacob's sons did here. And so, just a sad, sad situation here to take place here. A lot of illustrations we can get from this in our own life of how important it is that we properly not just react to a situation, but we properly respond to a situation. React is when we do the wrong thing, and the way I try to define the word respond and react. React is when we get mad and we do the wrong thing. Respond is when we think about it, we go to God, we ask for wisdom over the matter. That obviously didn't happen. Then Reuben, another one of the children of Jacob here, and his sin, he ends up actually committing incest with one of Jacob's concubines, his Bilhah, the handmaid here. He slept with Bilhah, one of his father Jacob's wives, in chapter 35, verse 20 and 22. Again, obviously wrong situation there. Just a wicked situation. And then we see Judah. Judah here, his immorality and his hypocrisy, the sins that he commits here. Judah selected a wife, and this goes to the story we was talking about just a little while ago, Tamar. He selected a wife for his son, who was Tamar. Again, killed by God for his wickedness. Tamar then married Onan, his brother. Onan is also slain for his evil ways in chapter 38. Judah then promises Tamar to marry Shelah, his youngest son, when he became of age. Well, he went back on his word. He didn't allow that to take place. And that's why Tamar decided that she was going to need to be taken care of by the family, because she no longer had a husband within that family, and she's going to deceive Judah. So she dresses up as a harlot, goes out by the way, and entices Judah to come into her. And Judah, not paying attention to who the woman was, decided that he was going to go into this prostitute. Obviously, here a sin in and of itself, much less it being with his daughter-in-law. Later on, when Tamar came up pregnant, Judah was upset. He was mad over this. He was mad because he thought that Tamar went off with someone else and got pregnant, and so he decided that she should be burned to death over this. And then come to find out, he's the father. Well, when he's the father, that shows his hypocrisy here. When Tamar displayed the seal and staff that she had asked for when she first pretended to be the harlot, and said, "I don't want anything, just give me your staff, your seal here, and that'll be all." And then when she comes up with pregnant, then Judah decides to have her burned, but then when he's presented back with his seal and staff, the story changes. Now it's not so bad. We'll let you live now here. And she ended up having twins, Perez and Zerah. And so again, just a very, very sad story here in the scriptures as to what had taken place here. All right, next week we will have one more class this semester. This is near the end of the semester. If not, actually, we're 15 weeks into it right now. 16-week semesters. So next week we'll probably have some study guides for you. And we'll talk more about that in the other things. Thank you.